When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. And it wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
Harvey, the last man that they appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
The Dark Knight is one of my favorite movies, not just because it's an incredibly well-made film, although it is. The cinematography, the performances, the pacing, the tension, it's all masterful. But what makes The Dark Knight special is that it's so much more than just a superhero movie. It's a meditation on weighty, timeless themes: chaos versus order, fear versus control, and the limits of law and morality. The most powerful theme in The Dark Knight is disillusionment. It isn't a story of good triumphing over evil. It's a story of how even when evil is defeated, the victory is hollow, compromised, and incomplete. Evil is beaten back, but only at a tremendous cost. And even then, the resolution feels fragile, uncertain. Batman saves Gotham, but the price is unbearable. He takes the blame for crimes he didn't commit. He chooses to become the villain because Gotham needs him to be one. The White Knight, Harvey Dent, fails. The system collapses under the weight of its own corruption, and Gotham, left in the aftermath, can only cling to a lie to keep hope alive. The film resonated so deeply not only because it spoke to timeless truths, but because it captured the mood of its time in a way that felt eerily relevant, especially in the United States. When The Dark Knight was released in the summer of 2008, America was at the tail end of one of its most politically disillusioning periods since Vietnam and Watergate. The Bush era had presided over a wave of scandals: the lies that led to the Iraq War, the unchecked expansion of executive power, and the slow erosion of trust in government. And just as the war began to fade from the headlines, the economy collapsed, taking millions of jobs, homes, and savings accounts with it. The financial crisis exposed a system rigged in favor of the powerful, a system where the people responsible for ruining lives weren't punished, they were bailed out. It was a moment of deep cynicism, the kind that made The Dark Knight feel perfectly suited for its time. But just as the movie painted a world consumed by darkness, another narrative was unfolding in real life, one of hope. A belief that, despite everything, the forces of light could still prevail, that good could win, and that hope came in the form of Barack Obama. For anyone who wasn't around at the time, it's hard to overstate the levels of optimism surrounding Obama's election. His campaign was built on the idea that America could believe again, that change was possible, that after years of cynicism, people could put their faith in a leader, in the system, and in the idea that democracy still worked. After everything, people had found a white knight until reality set in. Obama didn't fail to deliver on hope and change because he was uniquely corrupt or malicious, but because the problems he and the country were facing were deeper than any one leader could fix. The wars dragged on, the banks that crashed the economy went unpunished, bailed out, while millions lost their homes. Income inequality soared, and for many, the government felt as distant and indifferent to their struggles as ever. The people who had dared to hope again, after years of disappointment, felt betrayed all over again. And this time, the disillusionment was even worse, and it turned into bitterness. And in that bitterness, they turned to someone they didn't fully understand, someone who didn't promise hope or unity, but who validated their fears, that the system couldn't be trusted, that justice and fairness would never come through institutions, that playing by the rules was for suckers, that what was needed wasn't another white knight, but a dark knight. Someone who would act outside the system, even against it. Unlike traditional heroes, who embody idealism, courage, and morality, the antihero operates in the shadows, bending or breaking rules to achieve what others cannot. Antiheroes thrive in stories of moral ambiguity, social decay, and existential struggle, where traditional heroism feels inadequate or even naive. They exist in worlds where institutions have failed, where the people and systems that are supposed to maintain order are too weak, too compromised, or too corrupt to function. In these settings, the antihero becomes a necessary evil, someone who does what others cannot or will not do. This is the case in The Dark Knight, where Batman exists because Gotham's institutions have failed. The police are ineffective, the justice system is corrupt, the city is in chaos. A conventional hero, someone who works within the law, would be powerless. But Batman? He fights from the shadows, playing by his own rules because he has to. This is why the outsider element is crucial to understanding the antihero archetype. Antiheroes aren't just people who bend the rules of the system. They exist outside of the system entirely because the actions they believe are necessary push them beyond the bounds of conventional morality. What they do can't be reconciled with society's values, making them pariahs who must operate from the shadows, never fully accepted, never able to return to the world they seek to protect. The world they inhabit has no place for them. Batman is an outsider in every sense. He operates in the shadows, beyond the law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Gotham may rely on him, but he can never fully belong to it. The moment he steps into the light, he loses the ability to do what must be done. That's why the role of the antihero is often filled by vigilantes, lone wolves, and figures of moral ambiguity. Taxi driver's Travis Bickle sees himself as a warrior against the filth of New York City, but has no place in normal society. Mad Max wanders the wasteland, looking out only for himself until circumstances force him into reluctant heroism. These are people who exist on the fringes, who take on the burdens others can't or won't bear. The antihero emerges when the world makes traditional heroism impossible. At its core, The Dark Knight is about the failure of traditional heroism. It's about the limits of idealism in a world that doesn't play fair. The film asks a brutal question. What happens when the good guys can't win by playing by the rules? And what happens when the only person who can win isn't a hero at all? Harvey Dent is the perfect example of this. He starts off as Gotham's White Knight, the kind of hero people want to believe in. He plays within the system, follows the law, and believes in institutions. And for a while, it seems to work. He gets convictions, he locks up criminals, he restores some faith in Gotham's future. But then he loses everything. The Joker shows him just how fragile his morality really is. And in the end, Harvey doesn't just fall, he shatters. The system's great hope for justice becomes a symbol of its corruption, proof that no one is immune. Gotham needed someone like Dent to win, but when he failed, it proved that the law, institutions, and moral purity weren't enough. And that's why Batman steps in, not as a shining beacon of hope, but as something darker, something Gotham doesn't want to admit it needs. And if you think about it, this is the exact same disillusionment we saw in America after the Obama era. Obama was supposed to be America's White Knight, the leader who could unite the country, who could restore faith in institutions, who could prove that hope and idealism still mattered. And for a while, people believed it. But over time, the cracks started to show. The financial crisis crushed the middle class, racial tensions didn't disappear, they got worse. The political system became more dysfunctional, not less. And by the time he left office, many Americans felt like nothing had fundamentally changed. The system still felt broken. And in that moment of disillusionment, people didn't look for another White Knight. They turned to a Dark Knight. Trump was the opposite of Obama in every way. He wasn't eloquent, he wasn't hopeful, he didn't talk about unity, he wasn't interested in making people feel good. He was interested in winning no matter what the cost. And just like Gotham turned to Batman when Dent failed, a huge portion of America turned to Trump not because they thought he was a good person, but because they thought he was the only person who could fight back. This is where the comparison needs to be understood carefully. I'm not making a grandiose claim that Trump is like Batman. Trump has none of the selfless devotion to the common good that constitutes Batman's character. Batman sacrifices his reputation, his peace, even his own happiness for the sake of Gotham. He takes on the role of the villain because it is necessary, because someone has to bear the weight of the darkness so others don't have to. Trump, on the other hand, thrives on being hated, not as a burden, but as fuel. He doesn't endure scorn for the sake of something greater. He feeds off it, using it to deepen his power and hold over his supporters. But if we want to understand why Trump has such an unshakable appeal, not just among his hardcore base, but among millions of people who turn to him despite his obvious flaws, we have to take this seriously. It's easy to dismiss his followers as irrational, brainwashed, and simply fueled by hate. But that's a mistake. People turn to Trump because they lost faith in the system, because they saw what happened to the last person they pinned their hopes on, because they were tired of hearing about patience, about working within the rules, about trusting institutions that had failed them time and time again. If those of us who oppose Trump want to beat him, we can't just rely on scandals and outrage on the assumption that people will come to their senses. We have to understand why he's powerful, why he speaks to something real, because if we don't, we'll continue to lose to the forces he's unleashed. The thing that set Trump apart from every other political figure wasn't just that he was an outsider. It wasn't just that he was rich, famous, or even that he had no political experience. The thing that made Trump different, the thing that made him dangerous, was his willingness to be hated. This is the essence of the archetype of the Dark Knight. Batman isn't just someone who can fight crime. He is someone who can make the choices no one else could make. The choices that were too brutal, too ugly, too politically impossible for anyone else. That was the energy Trump tapped into. He built his entire political identity on the idea that he could say the thing no one else could say, that he would do what needed to be done, whether people liked it or not. And it started with a single moment. the first Republican primary debate in 2015. At that time, most people knew who Trump was, but no one took him seriously as a political candidate. And he knew this debate was his chance to introduce himself to the American people. Megyn Kelly confronted him directly, listing all the derogatory things he had said about women, calling them fat pigs, dogs, and slobs. And Trump, standing on that stage in front of millions of viewers, didn't apologize. He didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down. He gave an answer for the ages.
I think the big problem this country has is being politically correct.
This was Trump's opening statement to the nation. This was the moment that defined everything he was about. A normal politician would have tried to pivot, to soften his words, to insist that he was being taken out of context. But Trump knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just answering Megyn Kelly. He was speaking directly to millions of Americans who had spent years watching politicians talk around issues instead of actually addressing them. Because the cardinal rule of politics has always been, don't offend people. Get as many people as possible to like you. Build the broadest coalition you can. But this had created a system where politicians weren't just careful, they were fake. They spoke in rehearsed lines, hedged every position, and avoided saying anything that might cost them support. And over time, this didn't just make them seem cautious, it made them seem weak, cowardly, like they didn't have the courage to do or say what needed to be done to create real change. What started as an attempt at courtesy, at decency, at inclusion, quickly became something else. Political correctness, originally intended to make space for marginalized voices, had begun to feel to many Americans like a form of artificiality, if not outright dishonesty. There were problems people saw, problems they felt, problems they lived, that they felt weren't being talked about openly, because talking about them the wrong way could get you labeled racist, sexist, or xenophobic. The fear of being hated, the fear of being seen as wrong, was preventing a frank and serious discussion of the very issues Americans deem most important. And then Trump came along. He didn't care if people thought he was racist. He didn't care if people called him sexist. He didn't care if he was hated by the media, by elites, by progressives, or even members of his own party. And in that moment, when the crowd cheered, it was clear the rules of politics had just changed forever. For the first time in modern political history, a candidate had decided that being hated was not a weakness, it was a strength. And for his supporters, that hatred became proof that Trump was exactly who he said he was, proof that he was the only one willing to take on the corrupt elites, the rigged system, and the very forces that had kept everyday Americans powerless. Every attack on Trump, whether it was a media hit piece, a legal indictment, or even an assassination attempt, only reinforced his appeal. Because to his supporters, Trump isn't just fighting for power, he is sacrificing himself. He is willingly taking on the scorn of the powerful, the wrath of the establishment, the condemnation of the elites, because he alone has the courage to do what must be done. His legal troubles don't expose him, they vindicate him. The hatred he receives doesn't weaken him, it only makes him seem more legitimate. In his followers' eyes, Trump has taken on the role of the Dark Knight, the necessary outsider who must be despised in order to save the nation. And this leads to a dangerous reality. The more he is attacked, the stronger he becomes. His persecution complex directly feeds into the mythology his base has built around him. The very fact that he is opposed by the media, by the courts, by the political establishment is seen as evidence that he must be doing something right. And once you see Trump through this lens, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine a scenario where his supporters would abandon him. Because the more the system pushes back against him, the more it proves their deepest conviction that only he has the courage to stand against it. But this idea that a leader's legitimacy comes not from institutions, laws, or democratic norms, but from his ability to defy them, has starkly authoritarian implications, something the Dark Knight is fully aware of. In the dinner conversation where Harvey Dent praises the Roman office of dictator, Rachel is quick to push back. She reminds him that while Rome claimed this power was only temporary, it was easily abused. The last man given that authority, Julius Caesar, never gave it up. And at the end of the film, Batman himself embodies that exact danger. When the Joker has pushed Gotham to the brink of chaos, Batman decides that the only way to stop him is to invade the privacy of every single resident of Gotham. He uses advanced surveillance technology to hack into every phone in the city, turning them into a massive sonar surveillance system that allows him to track the Joker. Who gave Batman the authority to do this? He did. No due process, no checks and balances. The fact that he believed it was necessary was the only justification he needed. The police were helpless, the government was powerless, only Batman could save the city, and to do so, he had to do something that wasn't just impractical or impossible for anyone else, but also profoundly immoral. A mass surveillance program, if initiated by an actual government, would be a political scandal of historic proportions. It would lead to endless legal battles, congressional hearings, lawsuits, and possibly even a public backlash that would make it ineffective before it even began. But Batman doesn't have to deal with any of that. He doesn't have to follow the laws. He doesn't have to answer to anyone. He just gets the job done. And even within the world of the movie, the danger of this is clear. Lucius Fox, one of Bruce Wayne's most trusted allies, refuses to tolerate it. He tells Batman outright that it's too much power for any one man. He agrees to help him, but only under the condition that the system is destroyed after one use. Batman, to his credit, understands this. He has the good sense and selflessness to relinquish that kind of unchecked power once the immediate crisis is over. But what if he didn't? We don't have to imagine the answer to that question. We're living it every single day that Trump is in power. At the risk of stating the obvious, Trump is not Batman. He has no internal moral compass telling him when enough is enough. No Lucius Fox shutting down the machine. Instead, he is doing the exact opposite, expanding his power at every opportunity while dismantling every mechanism that could constrain him. And to do that, he must convince his followers of one thing, that the system itself is beyond saving. That is why Trump and his allies have spent years delegitimizing every single institution that could hold him accountable. The press is fake news. The courts are rigged. The Justice Department is full of deep state operatives. The election system is corrupt. Federal agencies are weaponized against Trump. If there is any independent body that might check his power, his first instinct is to convince people that it is broken, compromised, or working against him. Because once you believe that every institution is hopelessly corrupt, then the only solution left is the strongman, the Dark Knight figure. If the government cannot be trusted to dispense justice, then you need a single personality who is the law. If the media only lies, then the only truth can come from the leader himself. If elections are rigged, then why should they exist in the first place? The entire logic of democracy, checks and balances, competing power centers, falls apart. That is what Trump is doing. He's creating conditions for people to demand that he break the rules. He's ensuring that when he seizes more control, it doesn't look like a violation of democracy, but looks like democracy saving itself. But if The Dark Knight paints a picture of Trump's appeal, it also shows us the type of character needed to defeat figures like him. The answer is in Batman himself, not in his willingness to break the rules, but in his selfless moral character, in his willingness to bear the weight of other people's sins, to take on their lies, their crimes, their burdens, not for personal gain, but for the greater good. What will it take to defeat Trumpism? Leaders with uncompromising moral integrity, people willing to make the hard, impossible choices, not for themselves, not for power, not for wealth or popularity, but for the common good. Leaders who won't sell out to expedience, who won't follow opinion polls just to stay in power, who won't cower in submission when threatened by powerful donors or political pressure. It will take people with a true selfless devotion to the country as a whole, and a willingness to stand by that at any cost. If Trump rise signifies the failure of traditional heroism, then overcoming Trumpism will require a profound rebirth of genuine heroism. And unlike in the movies, there isn't one magical superhero coming to save us. No Batman, no Dark Knight, no single figure who will rise from the shadows and set everything right. If we want to see that day come, if we want to see those kinds of leaders emerge, then the only place to start is with ourselves. Every day, in our own lives, in our own small ways, in our own decisions, we have the chance to become those kinds of people. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but if history has shown us anything, it's that light doesn't return to the world on its own. It has to be brought back, one person, one choice, one act of courage at a time.